Welcome to the Ladder of Inference, the first of the three mental models we're presenting as foundations for the leadership platform and for the remainder of the workshop program in which you're now participating. In our presentation of the Ladder of Inference, we start by acknowledging the authorship of Chris Argyris, a pioneer in the field of organizational development. Why do we include the Ladder of Inference in this workshop program? The ladder helps us to get out of our own way. It helps us to disconnect ourselves from patterns of thought, assumptions, and conclusions that might get between us and the real truth of things. The ladder also opens us up to one another. It helps us understand why we need to be great listeners and engage in a search for truth rather than getting stuck in arguments about who's right and who's wrong. The concepts of the ladder provide valuable context for all the conversations you'll have in this workshop. One of the most important characteristics of leaders is that they are always seeking to understand. They are assertive and thoughtful interrogators. They ask questions with the intention to really listen to the answers they hear. For the effective leader, this quest for understanding is undertaken, even with the knowledge that the answers may not be what we wanted to hear or what we were prepared to hear. Now let me clarify first that this is not the ladder of influence, but rather the ladder of inference. An inference is a conclusion or a judgment you form based on what you deem as relevant information or evidence. So let's repeat that. Inference is a conclusion or judgment you form based on what you deem as relevant information or evidence. But your ladder of inference, the process by which you get to your inferences about what's going on around you, is a highly imperfect and incomplete process. So let's see why. The first rung on the ladder is all possible data and experiences. This is all the information that's available to you in this moment, and it's an overwhelming amount. There are billions of bits of data available to you right now, here in this room. This data includes the things you see, the things you hear, the things you're feeling emotionally or physically. In fact, your brain may use up to half of its capacity just processing visual images. So at the bottom of the ladder of inference, we recognize that our brains can't fully hear, see, or process every piece of data or every experience that's available to us. Now let's look at the second rung of the ladder, which is what I pay attention to. Because there's more information than we can possibly absorb and understand, our brain is constantly trying to sort through the data for the data it considers relevant. And our brain has to decide in the moment what it should pay attention to, and it makes these decisions about what's relevant by eliminating what it considers irrelevant, which happens to be the vast majority of all that data. It leaves just a few things behind that it thinks might have significant impact on your safety and well-being in some way. So imagine you've just received a short and pithy call from a customer. They're angry because their shipment was late. Now you need to decide whether or not this is important data. What are the contexts and considerations in your mind as you're sorting through this? Well, first of all, is my personal safety impacted by this incident? How might my critical workplace relationships be impacted? Are there negative consequences for me? Might others find fault with me for what happened? We ask ourselves, how big is the problem? Is it a priority over and above other needs that might be present? How does this incident make me feel? And is this incident a part of my history with this customer? What's the trust level I have to work with in resolving the matter? So as you consider all these questions and many others, let's say, for example, in this case, that you do come to the conclusion that, yes, this matters and I better pay attention to it. We do this sort of sorting of information all the time. This matters less, this doesn't matter at all. And we scan the environment for information that we believe has important effect on us. And meanwhile, we're paying attention to our customer While we're doing that, there's a lot of data that we're ignoring. There was a bird singing outside your window, you didn't hear it, along with the sound of the air conditioner or the traffic passing in front of the building. Someone says, did you hear that bird, or did you hear that car go by? And you'd have to admit that you didn't hear it, even though the data was available to you, because you chose to not pay attention to either of those other things. And even within the conversation with the customer, there were some things you missed. Your mind grabbed some words from the conversation, but missed others. At this point, you have a small slice of information, but because you're human, you start sizing up the situation and working your way up this ladder. Now, we only know so far that customer X called us and angrily announced that their shipment was late. But because our brain kicked into high gear, it takes us up to the next rung of the ladder, because we're wired to take in information and then take action. For much of human life, and even now to a lesser degree, our survival has depended on a quick trip up this ladder. So the third rung of the ladder is meaning and interpretation that I add. And the next rung above that is assumptions and conclusions that I form. This is where the storytelling begins, because of this need to make sense of things. In the stage where we add meanings and interpretations to what we see, we're still operating in a largely fact-free zone. And then we take the journey even farther by making assumptions and conclusions, maybe about the customer, about the sequence of events, about who was at fault, and about the consequences of the event. And we add these meanings, interpretations to a limited sense of data, and then we process those interpretations through our own lens in order to decide on a course of action. So what are these lenses through which we try to interpret reality? Well, the nature of our own personality is one. Are we trusting people? Are we suspicious? Are we anxious, confident, introverted, extroverted? Our personality has a lot to say about how we infer. Our culture, what groups or societies are we part of? How those collective beliefs and values of those cultures teach us about what's right or wrong. Our personal experiences. We're always scanning our past for patterns and events from the past that, in order to apply them to the current situation. Also, the amount of stress we're under, emotionally or physically. Our fears about our potential loss of status or security, our sense of dependence or independence related to our employment or to our key relationships. Our cultural, ethnic, religious, or gender biases. Do these send you up the ladder in unhealthy ways? You bet they do. And these biases, conscious or unconscious, create a powerful barrier between us and the real truth of things. There are many more lenses that we look through in order to start making meaning and interpretation out of what we see and then arriving at assumptions and conclusions. So go back to your angry customer and remember all you know about the situation right now is that the customer called you and they informed you that you were late with a shipment. At this point, you're moving up the ladder with great speed, but you're working in the realm of interpretation. You're applying meanings and interpretations based on your own personal perspective, because you don't know yet what really happened. In going up your ladder of inference about the angry customer, what meanings and interpretations might you add to this story to help you start to process it? So at the early stage of this interpretation, anything that starts with the problem is an interpretation at this point. We could say the problem is that we're late with shipments all the time. This always happens. The problem is that we don't get our products to the shipping dock fast enough. The problem is that the people on our warehouse and shipping operations are lazy and incompetent. The problem is that I've lost control of what's going on in this company. The problem is that I'm a loser, or I work for the wrong company, or the customer is just a jerk. There may be partial truth to some of these statements, but they aren't based on a curious search for understanding. Because we don't really know yet what exactly happened to make the customer angry, but that won't stop you from climbing this ladder and telling yourself stories. These statements of the problem is are our early efforts to tell a story and to create an inference. And these statements and stories are our way of trying to make things easy for ourselves and to avoid the hard work of listening and analyzing and instead replace those with quick actions that rely primarily on our prior experience and our biases and our emotions and our interpretations. Now, it's not always entirely unhelpful to tell stories. It might help you sort through what you experience and start to figure it out. Our brain loves to find patterns in things, and it does so in part by looking for how something that's happening now might be a pattern of something that's happened before. It's fast. You can go up this ladder in microseconds, and it can be reassuring because we want to think we know what probably happened, and that gives us a sense of control. But right or wrong, this storytelling starts to point you towards potential solutions, and sorting through potential stories for an accurate interpretation might be useful. But it's only useful if you're taking different stories and interpretations into consideration and not just your own. Storytelling allows your ego to protect itself. The ego is the biggest storyteller of all, and what it wants more than anything else is to tell a story that's favorable to itself. This is why we tend to judge others more harshly than ourselves, and because we want to attach ourselves to a version of reality in which we're the good guys. And finally, you just can't help yourself. It's how you're wired to go up this ladder. This ability to make quick judgments was helpful for our survival as a species. But in this modern world where we have less chance of being eaten by wild creatures, this storytelling can be counterproductive. Lastly, we arrive at action on this last rung on the ladder. Now that you've processed the information in your own way, you take action, and while justifying that action to yourself. In the case of the angry customer call, you may chew out the person or persons who you assume caused the problem. You may even apologize to the customer for something that wasn't your company's fault, or defend your company's actions to the customer without full knowledge of what your company did wrong. You may change a policy or a process to prevent it from happening again without understanding the potential side effects that solution might have. And you may even decide that your action is to do nothing, to go home frustrated, knock off a beer or two before you call it a night. Now again, I want to say that your ladder of inference isn't always wrong. You may interpret exactly what's going on, and you may take the right action in some cases. But it's unlikely that you won't stumble at least part of the time in getting to the top of your ladder. Whatever causes this stumble, whether it's a failure to see what you need to see, or to avoid biases and judgments, or to seek understanding, you'll end up taking actions that miss the point, partially or completely. A big part of our leadership journey is understanding that our ability to know the truth, what we call reality, is actually limited by this process of moving quickly up the ladder. And so, what can we do to make better judgments and arrive at more objective and wise decisions? So here are some ideas that can help. Number one, forgive yourself for going up your ladder. You probably can't stop the process, but you can recognize it more and more as it's happening. When you can, slow the process down. Look at this blue arrow. Go back to the bottom of the ladder and ask yourself, what did I miss? What information did I not have that it might be relevant? What additional perspective or points of view could I have sought from others? The blue arrow represents the reality that you might not be able to stop your rapid climb up the ladder, but if you're willing to stop the process and think, you can consider things more carefully before you take action. Number three, tell your story out loud. This is what I saw. This is how I interpreted what I saw. Essentially, this is my story. This is the story I told myself about that. And when you name your story, you can gain a more objective view into your own ladder. Now you need to seek understanding, point 4, of how others went up their ladder and how might others have seen things differently. In what ways are the assumptions and conclusions others made valuable and important? If their truths are contradictory to mine, how can I remain open to that? Point 5, don't try to own the truth or put too much stock in being right about things. Strive instead to be wise and objective and rational. I believe that being right is overrated and being wise is underrated. Being wise doesn't always mean being smarter than others. Instead, it refers to a calm and mature way of understanding. And point 6, get your ego out of the way. Your ego is always going to want you to be right. It's always going to get in the way of seeking the truth. I'd like you to invite you to discuss your ladder with colleagues, with your workshop cohort, with mentors. Compare interpretations. Own the fact that what you see isn't always the truth. It's not always reality. It's your version of these events that occurs as you go up the ladder of inference. So thank you, and go forth now and lead with as much reason and objectivity and awareness as you can, that you only hold a piece of the truth. Come down this blue arrow, seek the truth, seek the perspective of others, and just be aware of and monitor and manage your journey up the ladder of inference. Thank you.